Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be taking a look at games based after an anime series that I really like a lot, and that happens to be the Magical Knight Rayearth games. So in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at two of them, and they happen to be the Super Famicom and the Sega Saturn. Now, there is more than two games based after this series, but I'm only taking a look at these two because these are the ones that I'm more familiar with. But before we talk about the games, let's talk a little bit about the anime series itself. So it's a fantasy adventure anime with some magical girls, and it follows around three main characters, and they happen to be students, and they are Hikaru, Fu, and Yumi. So while these three characters are on a field trip to go to the Tokyo Tower, they end up getting sucked into a mysterious warp hole where they end up teleporting to a fantasy land called Sapphirow. And pretty much this land is endangered by the evil Zagato, who has adopted Princess Emerald, and they have to rescue her and save the land by becoming magic knights by resurrecting some dragons that will eventually transform into giant magic robots. So that sums up the story here. I'd figure I might as well explain that one first, since the two games I'm taking a look at both have the exact same story, but are very different in gameplay. Also, in case you didn't know, I actually did a review on the anime itself within my anime feature of 2016, and I still really liked it, since the first time I ever seen the show was all the way back in 2006 or 2007, it was either around that time. So after 10 years without seeing it and then revisiting it, I still liked it a hell of a lot. Well anyways, that's enough on that, because I have a feeling that this one's going to be a longer one, so with that said, now let's start taking a look at the games. And the first one we're taking a look at here is on the Super Famicom, and it has the exact same name as the show. So this one was developed by Pandora Box, and was published by Tommy. And no, not Tommy Wiseau, but the company Tommy. I'm willing to bet that you have at least seen their name on a bunch of toys before. And it was released in the year 1995 on the Super Famicom, which meaning that it was only released in Japan. And this game plays like a turn-based RPG. So the gameplay in this is that, you walk around on a map, going to towns, going to dungeons, and, killing monsters. All the good old things that makes up an RPG. And since I said it was a turn-based RPG, that means when you're on the world map or a dungeon, you get to bump into enemies, which is, randomly encountered. So the battles in this game are very straightforward. Obviously you take your turns on who gets to go first, and when it's your turn, you can either select attack, item, magic, move, or defend, or run. All very simplistic stuff to understand in a turn-based RPG. So whenever you level up, your stats go up, obviously. And ever so often you might be able to learn new magic attacks. So Hikaru and Yumi mostly have a lot of offensive magic attacks, where Fu has mostly healing magic, but she also does have a little bit of offense magic, but not too many. And you do get one extra character slot, but this one is actually for a guest character that will temporarily join your party. For an example, the first character that you meet as a guest character to join your party is Pharaoh, and they meet him in the Forest of Silence, which is very accurate to its source material. So that's all well and good. So yeah, pretty much the battles in this game are very straightforward, and if you played another RPG before, then this is definitely not going to be confusing. Now, going back to the enemy encounter rate in this game, I gotta say the enemy encounter rate in this one is really fucking high. In fact, I think it's a little bit too high, because, holy shit, I only take, a couple of steps and then, go into an enemy. In fact, throughout the game, I barely heard, what the whole thing of the map theme sounds like. That's how high it is. But that's not even really the worst part about the enemy encounter rate. To me, the worst part about it has to do with the level designs, and the level designs in this game are really bland. So all the dungeons in this game are very short and really don't take much effort to do whatsoever. And the only reason why they feel like they take longer than they should really has to do with the enemy encounter rate, because you're running into so many damn enemies at a time. So maybe that makes up for the bland level design for this game, is that they have to make you run into a shitload of enemies, so it takes longer to do. And of course, at the end of each dungeon, you just gotta fight a boss, and then, after you beat the boss, and it's next to the next dungeon or the next town, and so on and so forth. But at least this game is fairly accurate to what it's based after. At least all the scenes are very recognizable. But of course, a lot of the way how they get to the scenes is different, but, that's excusable. So everything here seems to be pretty straightforward and average, so yeah, that's all I have to say about the gameplay in this one. So now let's get moving on and start talking about the graphics, and the graphics in this one are pretty decent for the most part. So because this game is based after an anime, of course, a lot of the character portraits are actually pretty good looking for a 16-bit. Also, in case you didn't know, I actually really love the art style for this anime. I think it's actually one of my many favorites that came out within the 90s. But obviously, with it being on Super Nintendo, it doesn't look that good, but it still looks really good enough. Like, I really like the character portraits, and the way how they do look in battle is pretty decent. Although, if I were to complain about one thing with the graphics, is that some of the enemy designs are pretty bland looking, and of course some of the bosses don't have like any facial features. Like for an example, like when you fight Alcyone, she doesn't have any eyeballs. It's fucking weird, man. And some of the backgrounds are kind of hit and miss, where there's some backgrounds that do look kind of nice, and then there's some that just look kind of bland. And the effects for the magical attacks that you can do are just kind of okay. Nothing mind-blowing, but at least they do get the job done. Also, some of the mini cutscenes sort of things that they have is that they actually do look pretty nice too. Obviously they don't animate, but you know, like the picture that they show is actually really well detailed. So it seems like the graphics in this one are kind of a mixed bag, where you got some parts that do look pretty good, and then you got some parts that look just okay, and then you got some parts that are just kind of bland and boring. So when it comes to a 1995 Super Nintendo game, I've seen much better. Now, when it comes to the game's music, the music in this one is actually really good. You have a lot of nice catchy tunes, and of course a lot of them are very upbeat, which makes sense since this show is pretty lighthearted for the most part. But I really do like that boss theme music. I think that one's really awesome. And there's a few dungeon songs that do sound really nice too. But unfortunately, it seems like that the one song that they had to screw up here happened to be the opening theme song, where at first it kinda sounds nice, but then once it gets to like the heavy rock guitar part, that's where it kinda sounds like crap. Which is a damn shame, because the opening theme song for the anime is actually one of my many favorite openings. And I was actually really excited to hear what it would sound like on a Super Nintendo, but yeah, sadly it wasn't so hot. But other than that, the rest of the music in this game is at least good or really good. So now, if you want to go out and buy this game, if you want to get yourself an original copy on the Super Famicom itself, there's actually quite a few on here. So for an example, you can get a loose copy for about $8, or you can get yourself a complete copy going for about either $18 to $20, and of course there happens to be one asshole selling a complete copy for $145, but you know, fuck that shit. But typically speaking, this is actually a very cheap game to get, but with that said though, the game is going to be in Japanese only. But I have heard that if you do have devices like a Retron 5 or the Retro Freak, you can actually install patches to make your Japanese game be in English, which is pretty cool. Or you can get yourself a reproduction card of the game itself that already is in English, which is also quite nice. So at least this game is very cheap and affordable, which is a good thing. So now, as for my overall thoughts on this game, is that I find this game to be a very average RPG. Not good, but also not bad. So first, let's talk about the good. So the game respects its source material very well, since all the scenes are very recognizable, which is really good. The game is very simple to understand, so there's no confusion whatsoever, and it is easy to figure out where you're supposed to go. The music is also really good, and some of the graphics is a mixed bag, but I do really like the way how they did make the character portraits. I thought that was probably the best part about the graphics. And now, on to the not-so-good stuff. So personally, I think one of the weakest parts about this game has to be the level design. It's so bland and simple, it's like it's almost stupid easy. And that's another thing, this game is also pretty pathetically easy since you level up like almost like 2 or 3 battles. And there's not a whole lot of strategy that you really need to do in this game. I mean, most of the time you really just gotta use your most powerful magic attack over and over again until the thing dies. And like I said about the graphics being a mixed bag, well, yeah, some of the enemy designs in this game are pretty piss poor looking, and like I said, some of the bigger bosses have no facial features, which just looks really fucking weird. So yeah, that's mostly what sums up the reason why I think this is a pretty average RPG. Not good, but also not bad. But it is at the very least better in every way possible than a game like Sacred of the Stars on the Super Nintendo. Good God, I hope I don't have to review that someday, or maybe I might. since it is from one of my many favorite companies that happen to lay down a turd. Well anyways, when it comes to recommending this game, I'd really only recommend it to the fans of the series. Because at least if you are a fan of the series, you would at least get some enjoyment out of it, not like an amazing experience, but at least a decent one. But if you're not a fan of it, or you just never even heard about the show, or don't know a whole lot about it, then yeah, it's not going to be for you. And as for someone like myself, who is a fan of turn-based RPGs and is also a fan of the anime series itself, you'd think I would really love something like this, but unfortunately, I just think it's just okay. So I was kinda disappointed in this, which is a damn shame, but at least it's not the worst thing I've ever played, and it's also not the worst RPG I ever played on the Super Nintendo. So now let's start moving on and start talking about the second game in this video, which is probably the more well-known one. Mainly because this one actually came outside of Japan, and that happens to be the Magical Knight Rayearth game on the Sega Saturn. So it was developed by Sega themselves and was also published by them in Japan, but in the North American version it was published by Working Design. So you know what that means is that the North American version is super shiny looking, where not only the front cover is very shiny, but even the spine of the game, and also the back cover, and even the disc itself. I mean, like, holy crap. And interesting enough about the discs is that there's actually multiple disc arts for the game. There's 3 of them representing the 3 main characters. And I'll touch base on that much later. And of course, inside the game manual itself, it's very colorful with a whole lot of details and everything. In fact, there's even a part where they actually talk about the release of the game, because this is where things get really interesting. So in Japan, the game originally came out in 1995, and in North America, it came out in 1998. And not only that, but it was actually the ending of 1998, making it one of the last few games to come out on the Sega Saturn in North America. So a part of the reason why it took so long had to do with the fact that some of the source code actually had a hard drive crash, and therefore they had to completely rebuild it for this version. Now normally, if most other companies had this sort of issue when trying to release a Sega Saturn game, they probably would have just scrapped the project and moved on to something else, but Working Design still pressed on forward, which is why I do have a lot of respect for them. Because as you know, the Sega Saturn was not doing so hot, especially compared to the other 2 systems on the market like the PS1 and the N64. So it's pretty clear that Working Designs were very passionate about all the products that they put out, because they didn't care about trying to be like the best company there ever was. What their main focus was localizing games from Japan that would most likely not get localized by most big companies. Like, they really didn't need to spoil us with things like the shiny covers, the thick manuals, and even giving us some freaking stickers, because I totally need stickers in my life. But they did it because they fucking can. Well, anyways, that's enough about the backstory about how this game was released, and now let's finally start talking about the game itself, and it's an action RPG, kinda similar to games like Secrets of Mana and Zelda. So there's nothing much I can really add to the story here, since it's exactly the same as the anime, but of course there are some differences with the way how they get to certain areas and whatnot, but you know, that's totally understandable, so yeah, we'll just go straight to the gameplay. So it's a top-down game, very similar to the 2 ones I mentioned, being Zelda and Secrets of Mana. So it's like Zelda in the sense that you go to towns, and then you go to like dungeons that have some light puzzles, and then you fight some bosses at the end of them, and you can find heart elixirs which allow you to gain maximum health for one character. So pretty much like the heart containers in Zelda, and of course they also have one for an MP bar as well. And the part that really reminds me of Secrets of Mana is the fact that there's multiple characters that follow you around. But only in this game you only use one at a time, so of course the 3 characters are the same ones as always, Hikaru, Yumi, and Fu, and they all have their different abilities. So Hikaru uses a sword that slashes, Yumi uses a rapier that stabs, and Fu uses a bow and arrow that can shoot. And you can switch between the characters by pressing the shoulder buttons. And they all have different spells, where obviously Hikaru uses the fire spells, Yumi uses the water spells, and then Fu uses the wind spells, but of course she also has a healing ability which the others don't. And the way that you level up your characters in this game is not in a traditional sense by killing a bunch of monsters and gaining EXP. It all has to do with just progressing through the story and you just happen to get stronger. So eventually, as you get farther throughout the game, you can actually learn a charge attack where you hold down the attack button and you can do a more stronger hit. And the health and MP bar will be extended by a little bit each time. And by finding newer magic spells, you actually have to find a mirror within a dungeon where Clef will teach you a new ability for whichever character it belongs to. I guess you can say that is the equivalent of a Zelda game by finding a new item inside a dungeon that is mandatory to beat the boss or whatever. And you can learn new abilities like swimming and breaking through weak walls where you gotta talk to people within the town. It's kinda like a mini quest that is mandatory to progress. So you're probably thinking that there's not much of a reason to start fighting some of the enemies on the field considering you don't get EXP through them, but instead they drop items. So they do drop gems, which is the currency within this game, and of course they also drop replenishing items like ones for health and MP. Now one thing that is noteworthy about the exploration in this game is that it's actually pretty linear for the most part. Now sure, there are times where you may have to go back to another town because you gain a new ability where you can get something that you weren't able to before, which is nice. And there are some shortcuts that you can gain access to much later on by gaining more abilities and such. But what I'm trying to say is that there's no big open area that kinda interconnects everything together. So depending on the direction that you leave a town, it could just directly lead you to like another town, or it could lead you to like a forest where you might have to fight some monsters along the way. It's that kind of RPG. So even though this game doesn't have like a shitload of exploration, it still has a pretty decent amount of secrets to find. And those mainly being the health or MP extenders, or even some treasure chests where you can unlock newer items, and of course you can also have to collect these rainbow shards. And what the rainbow shards do is that you have a rainbow shard for each and every color of the rainbow. And if you collect enough of them of each color, then you can get to go to the Rainbow Junction shop, where you trade some of these in to get some exclusive new items that you can't get anywhere else. So at least there is that when it comes to finding out some of the secrets to find. Now one thing to mention just before I end the gameplay segment of this is that there's actually a tent that you'll see in every single town that looks really weird looking compared to everything else in the game. And there happens to be an old man inside there, and he gives you two options. You can either pay 5 gems or 20 gems, and basically the more gems you pay, the better the hint he'll give you in case you're lost on something. But there is actually a secret third option where basically you don't have to pay anything for it, and all you gotta do is that you gotta get your ass onto the internet and go on GameFAQs and look up what you need to do. Okay, in all seriousness, there's only 2 options, and of course you do want to save up your money in case you do want to get like other items from stores and such. So that sums up the gameplay aspect of this game, so now let's take a look at the controls. And I think the controls are really good. So the button layout is very easy, using the D-pad to move around, then you got one button to jump. Yes, you can actually jump in this game. And then you have your attack button, and then you have your magic button, and then of course, like I said earlier, switching between characters is simply by pressing L and R by scrolling through them. All done in real time. You don't have to pause the game and switch characters, although that can be done as well, but of course you can just simply doing it the faster way by pressing the L and R buttons, which is very nice. And all of this does feel very responsive, and surprisingly enough, even the jumping in this game is surprisingly pretty good for a top-down game. Because I'm sure as you know, when it comes to a lot of top-down games and there's a jump button, it's kinda hard to make your mark sometimes. Well, this one I think actually did do a pretty good job with that. So overall, when it comes to the controls, I really can't think of much complaints about them. Like, I do find the attacking feels good, using the magic is good, and, switching between characters is like almost instant. And the walking is good too. In fact, if you hold down the direction long enough, you actually start running faster, which is very nice. So, not much complaints here. So let's start moving on and talk about the graphics. And the graphics in this one are very beautiful looking. To be quite honest, I think this might be one of the nicest looking 2D games I've seen on the Sega Saturn itself. Because there's just so much bright colors, some very nice detail within the backgrounds, and even some of the character sprites are done really well, even though they are chibi style, but I do think they are very nicely done. And you got a lot of animation within the backgrounds, and even the characters' animations are flowed very nicely. And I do like what they did with the character portraits, where it looks like they took it right out of the show. And speaking of the show, the cutscenes in this game look like they are taken right out of the show, but of course the resolution is shrunken down a bit due to hardware limitations, but it does still look really good for the time. Also, something that is very much improved from the Super Nintendo game is that the overall level design in this game is much better. But they are still not perfect, of course, because they are still very short levels, but at least they are much more intricate and interesting, which I do think is at least important. But otherwise, I think the rest of the graphics in this game just look absolutely amazing. And it's also even more impressive for the fact that this is actually originally a pretty early Saturn game in Japan, but of course, as you know here, we got the game very, very late. But even after all these years, this game still looks just as amazing as it did back then, I'm sure. So now, when it comes to the game's music, I find it to be pretty great for the most part. So it does have a lot of catchy songs, and it also does have a few songs that do sound very upbeat, but it also has a lot of songs that are very relaxing and nice sounding. Probably one of my favorites throughout the game would have to be the Paluzu Village theme. That one is just really awesome sounding. And another one of my favorite tracks is the Rustling Forest, which usually plays throughout the forest levels, and that one is just really awesome too. Has a nice eerie atmosphere to it. But as good as the music is, unfortunately, there's only like 3 songs throughout the game that I found to be a little bit lackluster, but otherwise though, the rest of the OST is a damn good one. And speaking of music, they also do have the opening theme song throughout this game, but of course, if you're playing the North American version, then the song is in English and also is roughly translated. But I don't think it sounds bad though, but of course I do prefer the Japanese version since, like I said before, it's one of my all-time favorite openings within animes. But it's still pretty cool that they do have it though, but either way, the music in general overall is just pretty damn awesome. Alright, now here comes the grueling part of this video, is that if you want to buy this game, well, this one might cost you like an arm and a leg and possibly might have to sell your organs on the black market to get. So if you want to get yourself a North American copy of this game, it goes for about $400 to $500. Whippy. But if you want to get yourself a Japanese copy of the game, which is significantly much cheaper, then it usually goes for about $15 to $30. But I would only recommend getting the Japanese version if you know how to read Japanese, or if you want to resort to using a guide constantly. Because even if you are familiar with the story within this game, it's still kind of hard to figure out where you're supposed to go sometimes, since like I said, there are some skills that are required to progress through the game, and sometimes figuring that out is not always easy. So it's either one or two things. You get the English version, but you're gonna have to pay out the nose for it, or you get the much cheaper Japanese version, but unless you can read Japanese, then you're pretty much screwed. And personally for me, when it comes to like resorting to using a guide, I only want to use it if I'm like really stuck somewhere. I don't want to have to use it like every single time I play a game. That's just not as fun. So I'm sure, as you know, part of the reason why the game is as expensive as it is really has to do with the fact that it was one of the last games to come out on the Sega Saturn in North America, and as you know, that system is pretty much considered as a commercial failure, which is a shame because it has a ton of great games. And now let's get to the part where I start to randomly rant about something, because honestly this is something I just have to get off my chest. Now remember what I said earlier about the game having multiple disc art where, you know, you have one for green, blue, and red? Well, there's something about this multiple disc art thing that I'm not a huge fan of, and of course it has nothing to do with the game itself, it just has to do with people in general. So there are people out there that like to hoard multiple copies of the same game just because they can just get all the multiple like disc art variants. And then they go off on social media and be like, "Hey guys, look what I got, can I be a part of the cool club yet?" So first of all, my main complaint with this is that this kind of fucks over everybody else that actually has interest in wanting to play through the damn game. Because finding one copy of the game is already hard enough as is. And even if you do find a copy of it, it's going to be very expensive. So whenever someone does have multiple copies of the same game just because they want to have multiple disc art variants or whatever the fuck, then it's already making the game harder to find than it already is. Like, I own one copy of the game, but that's all I need. I don't need 3, unless I really wanted to get like 3 Sega Saturns and play the game 3 times at the exact same time, but you know, that's just impractical and just fucking dumb. And second of all, people that dick swing like that just bug the shit out of me. For instance, back in 1998, when this game first came out, no one did that kind of shit. And besides, I really don't think Work and Design back then were trying to make games because they knew for a fact in the future that their games would somehow become artifacts or some crap. And lastly, about the whole dick swinging thing, well, it just makes it look like a tool. Now, I know for a fact that I'm probably gonna get into a big shitstorm over this rant that I made, but I just wanted to call it some bullshit on some things that go on within the retro scene. Because I really don't think that the reason why a developer makes a game is just so like people can look at it. And that's pretty much my rant of the day. So yeah, I do apologize that it went on a little bit too long, but either way, it just needed to be said. So overall, it's just really unfortunate that this game is not easy access. Now, if you do want to emulate the game, well, first of all, you're going to have a decent computer, because if you have a shitty laptop, don't even bother trying. But if you do happen to get the game up and running, then it is good to know that the game is very playable on an emulator, which is thank fucking god. But sadly, there's like a couple graphical glitches, not too many, mostly happens within like the cutscenes and such, but there's a couple parts that do look kind of like fucked up. But the worst part happens to be the audio issues. Now, the background music itself sounds fine, and also the voice work sounds fine, but it's really the sound effects that are just god-awful. So if you are emulating this game and you really don't like hearing a lot of annoying ass sound effects, then it might be best that you might want to play the game mute and have like your own music playing. Now, one thing I forgot to mention before about the game is the voice acting, but I'm going to keep it short and say that if you see my review on the Grow Lancer Generation game, you know, another working design game, then you know for a fact that this game is going to have a lot of cheesy ass voice acting, and also some that are just not very good at all. I'm sure, as you may know, a lot of working design games, whenever they have voice work, they usually like to reuse the exact same voice actors, and a lot of them are just very corny as fuck. But sometimes it can be amusing, so there is that. Well, anyways, now let's get to my overall thoughts on this game, and that is that I think this game is pretty damn good. It's a really fun action RPG that is very simple to understand, and of course it happens to respect the source material very well. And of course you get some amazing visuals and some awesome music. But one thing that I really wish that was improved upon is that I do wish there was a little bit more open areas to explore, and maybe make some of the dungeons a little bit longer, and of course I do wish there was a little bit more magic spells to learn, and maybe even some additional items to use. And there is one thing that a lot of people have criticized with this game for. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but of course some people might think differently, and that's totally fine, is that this game is not too long of a game. Now, the reason why I don't have a big issue with this is that sometimes I don't mind shorter games, and also this game is based after an anime that is also not that long of an anime series. Like, do we really need every single game out there to be like The Witcher 3 length? So with that said, I don't have much issues with the game's length, but if there is one thing that would have been pretty awesome, just as a random ass idea, is that wouldn't it be awesome if this game had like an additional side quest that you can do where you get to go to like an original dungeon and fight an original boss that was like not in the anime, it was just all exclusive content to this game? That would have been pretty kick-ass. But of course, that's just wishful thinking, but either way, I'm allowed to dream, damn it. So yeah, I'd say that Magical Knight Rayearth on the Sega Saturn is not only a really good game for the fans of the anime series or the manga series, it's also just a really good game in general. But I'm still unsure if I'd recommend it to a non-fan of anime because, you know, it's a game that involves like using 3 chicks of magical powers and it's not really a manly man's game. But if that kind of thing doesn't bother you, then I can at least say that this game is definitely enjoyable for sure. And that wraps up that, so yes, this one is definitely my favorite out of the 2 that I reviewed, and there's actually more games that are based after Magical Knight Rayearth, but I couldn't get them to work properly, mainly because there's no fan translations that I found. So there's one on the Game Boy, and then there's one on the Game Gear, and both are RPGs. But the one thing that does make the Game Gear version kinda interesting is the fact that it actually got its own limited edition Game Gear version where it's a red Game Gear that says Magic Knight Rayearth at the bottom. Pretty cool. So maybe whenever I find the translated versions of these games, then I'll definitely do them at some point. So that'll take us right to the end of this review. So as you know, I'm still a huge fan of the anime series, and of course, the games have fared pretty well for the most part. Yeah, the Super Nintendo game was a bit average, but you know, it still wasn't bad. But at the very least, at least the Magic Knight Rayearth games are fared a lot better than, I don't know, let's say like the Fist of the North Star games where there's like a lot of misses and very few hits, but at least the hits are damn good. So now let's end this here. So, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a good day.